Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for being here, and welcome, Yossi. We're
Thank you.
so happy to have you here with us in Toronto.
It's wonderful to be here.
And
Thank
I've
you.
been excited for this talk for a while now, so let's dive in. So we're going to talk through how we're navigating this post-Holocaust era. Can you set up for people what is the post-Holocaust era, and what does that mean for you as an Israeli, as an American, as a descendant?
So, good evening, everyone. And it really is wonderful to be back in Toronto. So many friends here in this audience. And thank you, Rachel and Karen, for your warm words. So, when we speak of the post-Holocaust era, I believe we need to use the past tense. The post-Holocaust era, to my mind, ended on October 7th. My understanding of the key components of the post-Holocaust era was that it was the growing certainty within the Jewish people that Israel's permanence had been secured and that we had overcome the crisis of impermanence, which had marked Israel in its early years. The last existential war that Israel fought was the Yom Kippur War in 1973. Every war after that has been an asymmetrical conflict, Israel against terrorists embedded in their civilian populations. Those are ugly wars, but they're not existential. And so we began to take Israel's permanence for granted, that we won. At least we won that war. And in the diaspora, specifically the English-speaking diaspora, there's been a growing sense from the post-Holocaust, from the end of the Holocaust through the decades, that Jewish communities have finally found a place of genuine at-homeness, a kind of unconditional acceptance in their host countries. And I saw that evolution happening to American Jewry, where in the Jewish community that I was growing up in, there was still a great deal of insecurity. And gradually, Jews began to feel fully American and fully comfortable in their Jewish skins. And October 7th upended all of those achievements. And now that and of course one can look back and see the warning signs that were there all along. But there's still, for all of the crises that we were experiencing in the last years, there was still the sense that the trajectory of Jewish history is moving in a positive direction. And today, there's a big existential question mark over the two great achievements of the post-Holocaust era. Is Israel really, has its permanence been secured? And of course, with Iran moving toward a nuclear weapon, it takes the question of existential threat to a less ephemeral place, and really a tangible place. And in the diaspora, and again, I'm emphasizing the English-speaking diaspora, because in other parts of the diaspora, especially in Western Europe, whatever sense of permanence and security Jews have had, really, I think, began to dissipate in the 1980s and 90s. But that's still held, the sense of where we've come home, we're accepted. And you know, at the Hartman Institute a few years ago, we developed a curriculum whose title was From No Home to Two Homes. And I don't know if we would be able to formulate the curriculum in quite the same way today. Right.
So what happened on October 7th to disrupt that sense of optimism and that sense of at-homeness?
So in Israel, we experienced the worst massacre in our history delivered by our weakest enemy. And that's the first layer of shock. And the second is that this massacre happened within the borders of a Jewish state. We are a nation that sent commandos halfway across Africa in 1976 to rescue 100 hijacked Israelis at Entebbe airport. And we sent the Israeli Air Force into Addis Ababa at the height of the Ethiopian Civil War in 1991 to retrieve 14,000 Jews, Ethiopian Jews. And we couldn't save 1,000 Jews within our own borders. And so, you know, when Jews speak about October 7th, the formula that most use is the largest number of Jews killed since the Holocaust. And I personally am very uncomfortable with that formula.
Can you tell us why that makes you uncomfortable?
Because the framework for understanding Israel and its security problems is Israel. It's the Middle East. It's the Arab-Israeli conflict. It's not pogroms, and it's not the Holocaust. Israel is the answer to the insecurity of the Holocaust. And I'm careful not to say Israel's the answer to the Holocaust, because that has all kinds of theological implications. But it is certainly the answer to the insecurity of the Holocaust. And you know, we're now in the period that as Rachel mentioned, in Israel we call them the secular high holidays. And I don't think they're necessarily secular, but Yom HaShoah, Yom HaZikaron, the Memorial Day for the soldiers, and Yom HaTzmaut. And on Yom HaShoah we mourn the consequences of powerlessness. And on Memorial Day for the soldiers, we mourn the consequences of power. And then we subsume all of that into this great celebration. Since October 7th, this will now be our second, I believe. I mean, really, time has become very wobbly. I guess it's our second Yom HaTzmaut, but it does not have that unequivocal joy that it used to. And of course, the most immediate reason is the hostages. And as long as the hostages are still there, are still stuck in October 7th, we are still, in a way, stuck in October 7th. But I think it's deeper than that, because what we lost on October 7th was the certainty that Israel is the safe refuge, not for Jews. Israel was always a dangerous place for individual Jews, but for the Jewish people. And since October 7th, there's this deep unease. What went wrong was so fundamental that it calls into question for Israelis across the spectrum. It's not a political issue of our ability to sustain the Jewish state. Now, I believe that we do have that ability, and I think we proved we went a long way toward proving to ourselves that we still have what it takes to defend ourselves post-October 7th. But there is that something fundamental has opened up in the Israeli psyche. And so so we lost that certainty of safe refuge. And in the diaspora, my sense is, from speaking to friends here and in the US, is that what was lost was unconditional acceptance, that sense, that trust that the English-speaking diaspora from Australia to Canada to the US finally achieved the great dream of Jews. You know, we carried two dreams for 2,000 years. The first would be that we would return home to Zion, and the second is that we would find some genuine, safe, accepting refuge. And both of those dreams happened simultaneously after the Holocaust. It's one of the most extraordinary stories in Jewish history. And October 7th is the first deep challenge to the post-Holocaust success story.
What do you think the impact of that is on the psyche of Israelis or the diaspora Jews?
There was a tweet that I saw when Israelis were being hunted in the streets of Amsterdam.
Right.
When was that? It really feels like 10 years ago.
Maybe?
So 6 months ago, whenever it was. And the Israeli government sent a plane to Amsterdam to safely retrieve the Israelis who were there. So someone tweeted saying, the plane is circling the globe looking for a safe refuge for the Jewish people. Now, obviously, it was meant as a joke and not totally as a joke. That's the kind of humor that you would never have heard in Israel pre-October 7th. It's Jewish humor.
Right.
And Israeli humor always worked a little differently. It didn't have that kind of self-deprecating irony
Right.
that traditional Jewish humor has. And now it does. And that worries me.
Interesting. Yeah. I've seen this profound impact that October 7th has had on our Holocaust survivor speakers that we work with at the museum. We're so reluctant to make Holocaust comparisons in the field of Holocaust education. But then it's coming from the survivors themselves who who shared with us that they're started to have nightmares again, and the kind of, questioning, is Canada the safe place that we thought it was, because of the overwhelming response here in Canada to what happened October 7th, and we'll get into that in a little bit later. And I know from listening to the podcast that you're also reluctant to make these comparisons to the Holocaust. So can you talk a little bit about that and sort of why we go to the Holocaust as this point of comparison?
I think that psychologically, October 7th opened up 3 of the lingering wounds in the Jewish psyche from the Holocaust. The first was the sense of total helplessness, which we experienced on October 7th. The Israeli army was in total disarray. And we have just begun to unpack the stories, and of course there will need to be a commission of inquiry. And that sense, that shock of total helplessness is something that in the Israeli context, we don't have anything of that scale. There was the Hebron massacre of 1929, which in some ways, until October 7th, was the most horrific atrocity. And then in 1948, there was the massacre in Gush Etzion and the Hadassah Hospital convoy. We've had massacres nowhere near on this scale, which is why, for me, the framing I don't need the Holocaust to express the dimensions of the horror. This is the worst massacre by far of Israelis in 100 years of conflict. And by the way, not just Jews, because there were about 20 or 25 mostly Bedouin Israelis who were massacred as well. And of course, some were taken hostage. So the first Holocaust button that was pressed was this sense of total helplessness, which was true. October 7th, for one day, we became victims again. But it only lasted one day. We can go back to that later. The second psychological button that was pressed by October 7th that brought back the Holocaust trauma was the sense of aloneness. Now, we didn't feel it immediately, although I think many of us sensed it's coming. Initially there was this outpouring of support and sympathy, and in Israel people said, okay, we have that now, wait till we start really hitting back. So we knew, and I suspect many of you also knew that the sympathy was very temporary, and the sense of increasingly being misunderstood. And we are still, as I said a moment ago, we are still in October 7th. And the world has long since moved on. And to some extent, that's understandable. But it creates this tremendous psychological abyss between not only Israelis, the Jewish people, and the world. So this sense of aloneness, of not being understood, of being in some ways abandoned to our trauma. And the third wound of the Holocaust that October 7th has reopened is the need to defend our right to exist,
Right.
the legitimacy of our right to exist. And I hate that phrase, our right to exist. No other country has to defend, now with the exception of Ukraine, but no other country has had to defend its right to exist from day one of its creation. I met a few years ago with a group of German journalists who were visiting Israel. This is a Holocaust museum, so. And one of the journalists says to me, you know, we're very pro-Israel in Germany. We support your right to exist. And I said, thank you very much. And we're very pro-German in Israel because we support, at least now, we support your right to exist also. And there was nervous laughter, you know, and they finally began to realize that maybe they're setting the bar for being pro-Israel a little low.
Oh, right.
And so what has opened up as an active threat is suddenly the idea that it's legitimate to question the legitimacy of Israel's existence has gone mainstream. And you can debate this in polite circles. And that for me, as someone who grew up in a survivor family, that is in some ways the worst outrage of all. Because we know how to defend ourselves, we can deal with that, and I also don't believe that we're totally alone. You know, we have a lot more friends than we sometimes realize, but the idea that 80 years after the Shoah, the only country that really has to defend its right to exist on the international stage all over the world is the Jewish state, and that for me is unbearable. So I understand why we're using the Shoah as a frame of reference, but I think it's self-defeating because it undermines the great post-Holocaust success story. And there has never been an example in 4,000 years of, we celebrate, rightly, we celebrate the triumph of Jewish survival, but there is no example in our history of having gone from the abyss, the lowest point in Jewish history, which I believe was 1945, to the peak point in Jewish history, which I think is still true today, despite everything. We have never been more powerful, both in Israel and in the diaspora. We've never been more central on the world stage, which is admittedly a mixed blessing, but we've never been more important to the world conversation. The Jews really matter in the world today in a way that we haven't for 2,000 years. And how did we do that? And I believe that one of the ways we did it was not to see ourselves as victims. I did not grow up in a family that saw itself as victim. And the Jewish people, after the Shoah, rejected victimhood, which is why I don't believe that we belong in the hierarchy of victims that the DEI world has created. Because they're right to exclude us. We're not a victim people. It's not our identity. It's not, I don't believe it's especially Jewish to see yourself as a victim. And so for us to be lapsing, however understandably, back into a Holocaust psyche undermines the extraordinary achievement of the post-Holocaust era.
Do you see a difference in that response to victimhood in Israel versus the diaspora?
No, and that really worries me. And I'll say something that'll sound really curmudgeon-y, but one of the things that I'm upset about in Israel is the popularity of the phrase Am Yisrael Chai. Now, it's a great phrase. I grew up singing Am Yisrael Chai in Soviet Jewry demonstrations, but it's a phrase that reveals deep insecurity. And in Israel, Am Yisrael Chai was never a popular phrase. It was a popular phrase in the diaspora. And Israelis, I think if you would have said to Israelis, Am Yisrael Chai, they would have looked at you and said, well, yeah, that's kind of the whole point of why we're here.
Right.
And now you can drive on the highway, and on the electric billboards, you'll see, 5 kilometers to Netanya, Am Yisrael Chai. And I don't like it. I don't like it because it reveals a new Israeli insecurity and a lack of trust in the permanence of Am Yisrael Chai.
Right.
So if you have to say it, if it becomes a slogan, it means that there's something in you that you're not sure about. There was the great the late great Israeli singer, poet, songwriter Meir Ariel, who was a paratrooper in Jerusalem in '67, has a song where he says, "A person shouts whatever they're missing. If you're missing justice, you shout justice." So now Israelis are shouting Am Yisrael Chai because we're missing that sense of are we sure? Did we really overcome? And so I think it's important to talk about it.
Right. And is there a difference generationally in Israel, how people are responding to that sense of vulnerability?
That's a really interesting question. I haven't thought about it. My instinctive response is no,
That's interesting.
which worries me even more.
Right. So let's get into a little bit about this conflation of the Holocaust and October 7th. Last week on Yom HaShoah, we were struck to see images on the news of the recently returned hostages, Agam Berger and Ori Megiddish, that they were at Auschwitz for the Yom HaShoah commemorations. And it just felt like, why are we doing this to these poor men after everything they've gone through? I understand that it's a message of hope to the young people who are on the March of the Living, but I found it very upsetting to see them at Auschwitz.
I saw an interview with I think it was Sharabi, who said, and he's the one who came back, you'll remember, looking really, really gaunt.
Yes.
And the comparisons were made between survivors and Sharabi, Eli Sharabi. And he made a point of saying, he was there, he made a point of saying that what I went through, what happened here can't be compared to what I went through. And I thought that was really an extraordinary moment and an important moment that we really should have paid attention to. And so he went, my sense is that he went there partly to place his experience in some wider historical context in a positive way. We overcame this. The March of the Living is all about celebrating our survival. It isn't about victimhood.
Right.
And so I think that in that sense, my understanding of why the hostages went there was to participate in that sense of victory.
Right. So we have here, and elsewhere, obviously, this instance of the Holocaust the Jewish community making comparisons to the Holocaust, that what happened on October 7th, and also the rise in anti-Semitism being comparable to 1930s Germany. And then, of course, we're also experiencing the claims that there's a genocide in Gaza happening now.
So the Holocaust is having a moment.
Yes. Yes. So can you talk a little bit about this, these comparisons and how we navigate these two conflations that are happening both within the Jewish community and sort of against the Jewish community?
So it's such a strange moment because, and really it highlights this extreme dissonance between internal Jewish discourse and what's out there in so much of anti-Israel discourse, is that we're back in the Holocaust and seeing ourselves as victims. And the Holocaust is the frame of reference for so much of the anti-Zionist critique. And of course, we're the Nazis. And I noticed that there's a pattern in how some of the NGOs, the human rights NGOs, the anti-Zionist groups, are using the suffix CIDE, as in genocide, and applying it in their critique of Israel in all kinds of ways. So, for example, one human rights NGO accused Israel of damocide. Damocide is the mass destruction of houses. I know, I had never heard the term either. I think it might have been invented for Israel.
Just for this. Yeah.
Just for us. And then the American Association of Historians, a couple months ago, voted to condemn Israel for scholasticide. I think that also was invented for us. And the accusation was, I think it was twofold. One is that because we have been waging a war against Hamas for the last year plus, we have interfered with the ability of the Hamas educational system to function. So that's scholasticide. And we have attacked schools, which is true. We attack schools that are not in session and that Hamas has taken over as bases. So that's scholasticide. And why is it so important? Why is it so important for the other side to steal the Holocaust from us? And because that's what's happening here. And I think that this is, in a way, a moment that unconsciously is echoing the old Christian supersessionism. We're experiencing a kind of political supersessionism. Supersessionism was the pre-Vatican II doctrine, the pre-Holocaust doctrine, that said that the church is the new Israel. And the old Israel has lost God's favor, and we're no longer the real Israel. And this was a pillar of Christian theology until the church, the Catholic Church, had the extraordinary courage to face itself and to transform itself theologically. And what we're seeing is the return of supersessionism in a new guise, which is our story doesn't belong to us anymore. Right? The Hebrew Bible became the Old Testament, and the only people who really understood the Old Testament were the Christians. We didn't understand what the Old Testament was about. We forfeited our story. We were written out of our story. And we're being written out of our story now as well. We're being written out of the Holocaust, and we're being written out of our connection to the land of Israel. It's not ours. It's not Israel. It's Palestine and only Palestine. And so the way that political supersessionism is playing out, I think, is an unconscious echo, but very much in the tradition of 2,000 years of Western thinking about the Jews.
Wow. Do you have any thoughts on how we need to address this, sort of how to take back our... Sorry. Do you have any thoughts on how we take back the narrative? I mean, as a Holocaust institution, we're so concerned about putting ourselves out there in certain platforms because of those claims that we hear out in the world. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on how, as a Holocaust institution, we navigate this current challenge.
So the question is, how did we come to the point where the Holocaust is being weaponized against the Jewish people?
Right.
And we are seeing a crisis in Holocaust education, commemoration, the likes of which we haven't experienced before. And it's also it's interesting to think about the end of the post-Holocaust era, is that during the post-Holocaust era, the Holocaust was supposed to be, and to some extent, certainly in again, the English-speaking diaspora, did function as a kind of immunization from extreme anti-Semitism and from the mainstreaming of anti-Zionism. The Holocaust did provide a high degree of immunity for Jews. And one of the main indications that the post-Holocaust era is over is the fact that the Holocaust is now a principal weapon against the Jews. There was a mural in Milwaukee that a Muslim had placed. Some of you, I see, are nodding. So we've all become experts. You know, you mention a city, oh yeah, that was the mural, right? So, and I've been collecting, I have these bursting files post-October 7th of anti-Semitic incidents around the world, and Canada has its own pride of place. So this mural in Milwaukee had a swastika and a Magen David, and it said, how does it feel to become that which you most hated? And I've heard that same slogan cropping up in various places. So the Holocaust has become a major weapon against us. Right. How did that happen? With all of the effort, with all of the education. And I think we really need to have a serious conversation about that. But just some preliminary thoughts. And the first is that I think that in presenting the Holocaust outward, for very understandable reasons, we tended to universalize the message. And what was understandable about that was, if you want to make this relevant to people, then explain that this is to some extent a universal phenomenon, except that it isn't.
Right.
And just as the Holocaust is unique, it's uniquely a modern experience, and it's unique in that it's drawing on 2,000 years or more of hatred. The anti-Semitism that made the Holocaust possible is also unique. We have tended in Holocaust education to the world to emphasize Holocaust as racism. The cause of the Holocaust was racism. And certainly racism is one of the causes. The Nazis were obviously racist, but it was not the only cause. And anti-Semitism works differently than racism. Right. Anti-Semitism is not just the hatred of the other. It is the transformation of the Jews into the symbol of whatever a given civilization regards as its most loathsome qualities. Anti-Semitism is the symbolization of the Jews. Under Christianity, the Jews were Christ killers. There's nothing worse, there's nothing more loathsome for Christian civilization than that. Under Islam, we were called the killers of prophets. For the religion that venerates the prophet, that's the ultimate crime. Under Marxism, the capitalists. Under Nazism, the race polluters. And now, in the era of international human rights, anti-apartheid, the Jewish state becomes the embodiment of all of those qualities that enlightened society regards as the most detestable. And the irony here, of course, is that this new culture of international law and human rights is a direct outgrowth of a response to the Shoah.
Right.
But we have lost the narrative.
Right.
And now all of that is turned against us. So I think that we need to first of all start questioning the ways, the universal application of the Shoah. We need to be thinking about whether we are making a clear enough distinction between anti-Semitism and other forms of hatred. And that's not to say one is better or worse or more consequential than the other. We should not play that game. It's a losing game. But we need to emphasize it's different. And, I'm not going to say that we suffered more. There's no way to measure the suffering of someone in a transatlantic slave ship for 2 weeks in the hull of a slave ship, or a cattle car. I mean, these are just obscene comparisons. And so it's not a competition. It's not a victim competition. It's understanding the specificity of each historical experience. Racism needs to be understood on its own terms and not conflated with anti-Semitism. And anti-Semitism needs to be explained on its own terms. So we have to do a much better job there. And the last piece of this, which I think is really, really important, and that has to do in some ways more with our internal Jewish education and commemoration of the Shoah, although I believe it does have application for how we speak of the Shoah to the world. And that is, what's the main takeaway? When somebody goes into your museum, what do you want? And I would say that until October 7th, the main takeaway would be we want them to come out understanding the consequences of hatred. We want them to be better people, more tolerant, certainly not to be anti-Semitic and racist and all the rest of it. But this is what we're experiencing post-October 7th is not classical anti-Semitism, even though in the symbolization of the Jewish state, it fits that pattern. But we're experiencing an assault against the Jewish people that doesn't have to be motivated by anti-Semitism. And that's something we're not equipped to handle. It is an assault on the Jewish reclamation of power, the post-Holocaust return to power. In Israel, sovereignty and military power, hard power, and in the diaspora, soft power, which is political power, philanthropic power, building alliances. And the Jewish people after the Holocaust, both in Israel and in the diaspora, reached the same conclusion, which is that powerlessness had become quite literally unsustainable, untenable. And we returned to power. What is under assault today is the legitimacy of the post-Holocaust Jewish return to power. And the basis of the Jewish people's healing after the Holocaust was power, our return to power. The story we have to start telling and owning and being proud of is how we went from complete helplessness to power. Now, power is a very complicated moral tool. And when you opt for power, you lose your victimhood. The two do not go together. We were victims on October 7th because we didn't use our power. By October 8th, we weren't victims anymore. You can't look at the devastation of Gaza and say we're victims. Now, I believe we had no choice but to fight this war in the way we have fought it. But you can't fight this war and still see yourself as an October 7th victim. It just doesn't go together. And so the story that we have to own and we have to tell is the post-Holocaust Jewish recovery. And we don't tell that story. We don't tell it well enough. And that story it begins the day after the Shoah, and it begins in the DP camps, the displaced persons camps. I'm working on a book now about the post-Holocaust era,
Right.
and I've been working on the DP camps. It's one of the most extraordinary stories. It's been largely forgotten because there were all of these dramatic events leading up to the creation of the state. But what happened in the DP camps was that the survivors created our first post-apocalyptic Jewish societies. And in these camps, they created a new form of Jewish identity, which was totally Zionist. The DP camps, the dominant culture in the camps was Zionist. There was no organized form of anti-Zionism in the DP camps. And so there's a story there that we have to tell. Now, if I could just say one last thing here, because it's a very complicated story. On the one hand, we need to insist on separating the creation of Israel from the Holocaust, because Israel was not a gift that a guilty world gave to the Jewish people. The world did not feel guilty after the Shoah. And the Israeli historian Yehuda Bauer said, I was just watching a clip of his, a fantastic clip, where he said he went through the documents. He went through all of the diplomatic correspondence surrounding UN partition vote in 1947. He said there wasn't a single mention, thousands of documents, about how the Jews have suffered so much they deserve a state. Not one mention. He said the only mention in the UN debate was from the Soviet ambassador, Gromyko, who very cynically was using the Holocaust. Believe me, it was not from a deep moral sense of contrition for the Jewish people. And so it is a lie that the world gave us Israel because they felt guilty. And nobody gave us Israel. We created Israel. Israel existed before it was declared a state. In 1948, the Ben Gurion's announcement was a formal recognition of the reality on the ground.
Right.
And if you look at what the Palestinians have done with 25 years of international support for statehood, and what the Zionists succeeded in doing in the years leading up to statehood under conditions that were at least as difficult, then you really begin to appreciate the Jewish achievement of building a state. So on the one hand, we have to insist that Israel exists because of thousands of years of Jewish historical connection to Israel, because of the longing for the land. It is not a quote, gift related to the Holocaust. But in telling the story of how we recovered, Israel is central and power is central. The two flags on the bima of the synagogues of Jewish communities in the English-speaking diaspora tell the story of the Jewish reclamation of power. That's what those two flags represent. They represent the healing of the Jewish people. And think about the intuition that, I know this is a very long answer to your question.
Okay.
I'm sorry. Look, I'm working on a book, so it's my chance to vent, you know. And the intuition of the generation after the Shoah that made the decision to put those two flags not only in the synagogue, but to flank the most sacred place, the Torah Ark, with these two secular symbols. But I think that the intuition was that these are the two symbols of the recovery of the Jewish people. And that gives these two symbols a certain sanctity. And they're there not as secular symbols, but as symbols of the eternity of the Jewish people. And so that's the story we have to start telling. And one last point, which is that in 2033, we are going to be commemorating 100 years to Hitler's rise to power. Now, a centenary in this time in history is like, 500 years in human consciousness. And it is history. The Holocaust is now history. It's hard for my generation. For my generation, it will never be history. We grew up with it as an intimate part of our family experience, our community experience, and certainly in Canada, where survivor presence was so formative in creating the contemporary Canadian Jewish community. But it's ending. And we need to make the transition to the Holocaust from open wound to history. And to bring this conversation full circle back to your question about October 7th, it's counterproductive for us to be seeing ourselves as if we're back in the Holocaust or pre-Holocaust era. We are really in the post-Holocaust era. And 2033 is looming.
Right.
And we need to try to figure out what do we need to say? And I believe the story we need to tell, even more, obviously we need to tell the story of the Holocaust, but we need to tell the story of our exodus from the Holocaust. That's a story we have to celebrate. And that's a story of the empowerment and the success of diaspora communities, the political success, the financial success, rather than, in America, the American Jewish success story is now being portrayed by many progressives as white privilege.
Right.
We need to reclaim that success in a Jewish context. And Israel is the same, obviously the same dynamic. So the story we need to start telling is an unabashedly proud story of our reclamation of power.
Thank you. Can I ask you how you see that sort of playing out in places like university campuses? Do you have
Not good.
Because it's hard to imagine how to, for us among Jews, I can see that being a beautiful conversation. I just don't understand how we have that conversation in that context.
Look, we can't win the progressive conversation.
Right.
And we have lost the ability to argue our case on their terms, which is why, for me, I'm not interested in proving to them. I'm interested in proving to our kids that Israel isn't a settler state. Our kids need to understand that.
Right.
But we can't win there.
Right.
And the Jewish people was always a little bit countercultural. We were always, we always said yes to certain things, but we always said no to other things. And what we tended to say no to was the prevailing culture, going back to pagan times. And, Avraham Avinu, Abraham, is called Avraham HaIvri, Abraham the Hebrew. And the rabbis say that he's called Abraham the Hebrew from the root of the Hebrew word Ever, which means the other side. That Avraham stood on one side and the whole world stood on the other. And so that's in us. We're a bit contrary, and we were countercultural for 2,000 years under Christianity and Islam. We said no. They said, there's a new divine revelation, and the curmudgeon Jews said no. And this is another moment where we need to own that curmudgeonness.
Right.
And we need to get used to the fact that we are going to be countercultural. And one expression of that is social media. Social media, for me, is a profoundly anti-Jewish space. Not because of what's written there about Israel, although obviously, but the thing itself, the idea, the notion that you could convey important ideas in however many or ever few characters is an anti-Jewish idea.
Right.
You look at the
Absolutely, yeah.
Talmud. The Talmud is 2 million words.
Right.
And you know, there you have my book here. You know, that I don't know how to write books for the social media age. I'm anachronistic.
Right. And
But
we like to have a conversation, and
Yes.
there's no ability to have a
yes,
conversation.
but
there.
we are an anachronistic people, and we need to own. We need to own that we are going to be always a little bit out of step, and it's hard for us after 2 generations of being fully accepted or feeling that we were fully accepted. It is. I don't think it's more than 2 generations.
No.
But it was 2 generations. And to go back to saying, well, you know, in a way, we're kind of back in Jewish history in the sense that we're not going to be, you know, American Jews, every poll in the last years showed American Jews as the most beloved and admired minority. Is that really going to be true in the next poll? Or in 5 or 10 years from now when this generation comes of age?
Right.
So it's really difficult for us. But I think that we need to just say our truth. And we will find allies. We will find people who will hear that. And we will find others who will see us as the embodiment of evil, which is a very familiar place that Jews have been in for thousands of years.
Right. Right. Okay, we're going to take some questions from
can't
the
end on
audience.
that
We can't end
note.
on that, but I'm going to just grab the questions. And I want to ask you a little bit about your book. Thanks, Rachel. Can you tell us a little bit about your book? I understand that you set out to write this book before October 7th, and you've now had to really adjust your thinking. Can you tell us sort of where you were and where you're going now?
I worked on this book for about 5 years before October 7th.
Wow.
And so it's a process. And the book is called The Wisdom of Survival, and it's about the post-Holocaust Jewish success story. And it celebrates it. It points to certain failures that were in some ways inherent in the success story and that are coming out now. And it looks at the post-October 7th Jewish reality and asks the question, what can we learn from those 80 years or 75 years leading up to October 7th? And how do we meet the challenges that we're facing?
Wow. And when do you expect to?
That's a really bad question.
We won't ask that question.
My publisher just gave me an ultimatum, a deadline that I have no intention or ability to meet. So I don't know. Okay. I don't know.
So this is a question about a conversation with your younger self. Do you still think that, as you wrote at the entrance to the Garden of Eden, interfaith dialogue still has a role today after October 7th?
Still what?
Has a role today, post-October 7th?
No, it's a great question, and I've devoted a good deal of my life to interfaith work, especially with the Muslim community, and I still deeply believe that we have no choice but to do interfaith. And my approach to interfaith, or my motivation for being involved in interfaith, was really twofold. I do have a deep spiritual commitment to the intimacy in the conversation among religions, which was never really possible until the last 50 years or 70 years. And I feel extraordinarily blessed as a religious person to be living at a time where you can access the wisdom of other religions so easily. The other motive, in some ways the more urgent motive that I felt, and this again is the case especially in terms of our relationship with Islam, is that the 21st century for Jews is going to be largely determined, at least in terms of our physical safety, by our relationship with the Muslim world. And And in Israel, that's obvious. We live in the heart of the Muslim world. But in the diaspora, as you've experienced here, so much of the assault on Jewish communities in the diaspora is coming from Muslim communities. And I think we should say that out loud. I don't think we need to say that behind closed doors. But I see that as an even greater incentive to try to reach out and see who is it in the vast Muslim world that is willing to engage with us. Now, before October 7th, my approach to Muslim-Jewish dialogue was I have no preconditions. I don't care what you've said about the Jews. You could have been a Holocaust denier. If you're coming to the table and you're willing to listen to me, I'm willing to stay at the table and listen to you. Our two communities are in a very, very deep struggle, and whatever healing can be done, I'm there. Post October 7th, I'm much more selective. Mm-hmm. I will not engage with Muslims who are October 7th deniers or celebrants or minimizers or relativists. All of the terms that one can apply to how the Holocaust is being treated. Here, you see, I'm making the comparison to is what's happening to October 7th memory as well. So those people I will not engage with. Right. But I don't expect my Muslim interlocutor to have spoken out publicly against the massacre. That's part of what dialogue needs to foster. Right. But this idea that we could have dialogue and leave that out, the unpleasant stuff out, leave Israel out, I think that is not tenable.
Right. Well, I think that's hopeful for us to hear that you're still...
I don't think we have a choice.
Yeah.
Our physical safety will largely depend on our relationship with Muslim communities.
Right. So this question looks to the future. This is the person asking the question, this is in quotes. October 7th was horrific, but over the next 10, 20, 50, or 100 years, we witnessed the following positive changes in the trajectory of Jewish or Israeli history.
Thank you for that question.
How do you feel that?
I'm very hopeful first of all, for Israeli society. And I'm hopeful not just because of Netzach Yisrael, and yes, all of that is certainly there in the background. But what makes me especially hopeful for Israeli society are two things. One is the extraordinary heroism that we've seen since October 7th. It's astonishing. And this generation, the TikTok generation, is as my generation of Israelis disparagingly called them, is the generation that is fighting Israel's worst war, least glorious war, longest war since 1948. There are kids who have been in Gaza for 500 days. And it is Israel's most thankless war. And they are extraordinary. And the second thing is... The second thing that gives me hope is Israeli society, that we pivoted from October 6th, which was the most divisive year in Israel's history. We were devouring each other. And literally overnight, we reached one of the peak moments of our national unity. Now that's gone. This government is, and we haven't spoken, fortunately, what a relief to have a whole conversation and not speak about this government. But this government is in its DNA a government of October 6th. It is a government of schism. It feeds off of hatred of the other, whether certainly the other the other outside of the Jewish people, but even more intensely the other within the Jewish people. And my friend and colleague at Hartman, Tal Becker, who I heard is going to be here, Tal says that the difference between a nationalist, and this is a generic description, it's not only applies to us, the difference between a nationalist and an ultranationalist is that a nationalist seeks to unite their people against an external enemy, and an ultranationalist seeks to unite their camp against the rival internal enemy. And that's this government. This is an ultranationalist government. And it's not a question of left or right, it's a question of ultra. And so this government has brought us back, or is trying to bring us back to October 6th, but most Israelis don't want to be there. And I believe that a strong majority of Israelis want to use October 8th as the foundation for the next 10, 20, 30 years. Every poll since October 7th shows this government falling. Some polls by very large majorities. And that, for me, is an expression of a great yearning among Israelis for healing. So I think that when this war ends, Israeli society is going to have to choose between October 6th and October 8th, and I think we're going to choose October 8th. The bad news is that this government has succeeded in creating a large minority of Israelis in its image, which is new in Israel. The question is how permanent is that? Can that be gradually transformed? But that's certainly the reality today. But I'm very hopeful for the healing in Israel. The other thing that I'll say about this government and these terrible 2.5 years, and it's not just post-October 7th. It's very much the year leading up to October 7th. And it's not a coincidence that October 7th happened on this government's watch. And it happened when we were tearing ourselves apart and vulnerable. And for me, this is a government that is in some ways the embodiment of all of the flaws in our collective character that we've been carrying as a people for 4,000 years. And you go back to the biblical period, and it's all there. Joseph and his brothers, the hatred between brothers, the ingratitude in the desert. Right after the revelation at Mount Sinai, we're building the golden calf, not our finest moment. And so every people has archetypes. Right. Every people has positive collective traits. There are stereotypes for a reason. and every people has strong points and points that it needs to work on in its national character. Right. This government is forcing us to look at the character traits that we've carried in us. And I believe one of the reasons we've come home is to face those negative impulses in us that have gotten us, that have caused so much misfortune in Jewish history. And this is one of those moments again, but this is a defining moment where we have to face it and go through it.
Right. Thank you. The next question is, what role do journalists play in telling the truth today during the crisis? What even is the truth? What does balance and objectivity mean in newsrooms? This is from an aspiring journalist.
Good luck. When young people ask me about journalism, my response, and I worked for many years as a journalist, my response is completely seriously that if there's anything else that you feel passionately about, for all kinds of reasons, financially as well, do that. If, however, you are one of those people who have always dreamed of being a journalist, who don't want to be anything else but a journalist, or who in my case couldn't do anything else but journalism, then become a journalist. So that's some unsolicited advice for you. But where I think journalism began to go wrong, and I saw it happening in journalism school, I saw it happening in my generation, the difference between my classmates and the former journalists who were our teachers was that for them, journalism was the pursuit of truth. Now, truth is obviously elusive, but what defined the integrity of a journalist was the commitment to pursue truth, however elusive. What began to take hold in my generation, which was the generation of Watergate, 3/4 of the students in my class decided to become journalists because of Watergate. And so you had a crusading spirit coming into journalism. And with that came a commitment to social justice. Now, journalism is not about the pursuit of justice. It's about the pursuit of truth. If you try to use your journalism to pursue justice, you are going to get the truth wrong, because you're going to choose sides, and that's going to blind you to sometimes what's staring you in the face. And that brings us to Gaza. How is it possible that these really smart journalists who are out there seeing it, how can they get the story wrong so consistently? And the answer is that they're not seeing it, because they're only seeing what their narrative of justice, their lens of justice is allowing them to see. And the classic example, and we all will remember this, the hospital that was bombed. I think I can just use that as shorthand and not go through the whole story.
Yes, I think so.
And as a former journalist, I saw the headline live. I saw it on the New York Times, and the headline was 500 said killed. And my first, most obvious question was, 500? It will take days, if not weeks, to sift through the rubble if there was a direct missile hit on this hospital. You're not going to have a body count for days. And the New York Times is running with 500 dead a half hour after the first reports, and everyone else is picking up 500 dead. And so that was the moment that we all kind of knew that this was going south.
Right.
So truth, justice, journalism needs to be about not about truth, but the elusive pursuit of truth.
Right. Thank you. Do you think Jews in the diaspora are naive to believe that the Holocaust can't happen again? How can we continue to hold empathy for the other side, the Palestinian neighbors, when facing them? Those are sort of two questions, but
you cheated. That's a Jewish question. We have to draw a distinction between vulnerability and victimhood. Jews in the post-Holocaust era everywhere are more vulnerable than we were before October 7th. And we could become, God forbid, we could become very vulnerable. But that's not the 1930s. And the 1930s are not going to happen again because, obviously, first of all, because of Israel, but also because if, God forbid, Western societies start descending into violence, and I don't see that really happening in Canada, I do see the possibility in the US. There is a very strong, as we all know, a very strong culture of violence in America, and Jews could be targets or caught up in growing violence. But if that happens, there are going to be lots of targets, and it's going to be diffuse. You're not going to have a situation anymore where the Jews are going to be the targets of an organized society.
right.
we can have, again, we can have anarchy, we can have really bad situations, but we also, we need to, obviously we need the past as a reference point, but the past can't be a literal reference point, because then that becomes as narrowing as not drawing on the past altogether. And what I think we need to start getting used to a very wide spectrum of possibilities. One side, one point of that spectrum is the golden era that has ended, and the other point of that spectrum is the 1930s. And between those 2 points, there are lots of possibilities. And we need to figure out how do we maximize our substantial defense mechanisms. And it will vary from country to country. Maybe Australian Jews feel more vulnerable than Canadian Jews because they're a smaller community than you are. You probably feel more vulnerable than American Jews. American Jews are feeling more vulnerable than American Jews pre-October 7th. So there is every community will experience vulnerability, the extent of vulnerability in a different way, but not to confuse vulnerability with victimhood.
Thank you.
There was that second, do I have to answer that second question? What was it? Remind me.
Is how can we continue to hold empathy for our Palestinian neighbors when facing them?
Look, I have, since October 7th, I've had a very hard time with empathy, not in my head, but in my being. In my head, I know that I should be empathic toward civilians who are not combatants, whatever their attitudes toward Israel are. If they're civilians, if they're non-combatants, then I should have empathy for anyone, including my Palestinian neighbors, and maybe especially since in the long term I have to live with them in one way or another. But it has been very difficult in my being to unfreeze. Many of us, I think, became frozen on October 7th, and especially because Palestinian suffering has become a very potent weapon against us. And so it's very hard to open your heart to the suffering that's being used as a weapon against you. I think that for the sake of, and first of all, just on an individual basis, for the sake of my own humanity, I need to unfreeze. Now, that's not the same as saying that I should let my empathy undermine my commitment to fighting my enemies. That's a move that I see happening in parts of the diaspora left. And I think that's a very dangerous move. How do you maintain empathy while at the same time saying we have no choice but to continue to be inflicting the suffering that I feel empathy for? Because that suffering that you feel empathy for your neighbor, I'm causing it. So that complicates it, because you want to protect yourself from those accusations. Mm-hmm. But so that's an individual struggle. As a people, we have to have a better conversation on Gaza than we have. And when I spend a lot of time on the Ben Gurion JFK line, and especially since October 7th, those trips have become really disorienting, because I come to the U.S. and the conversation there is as if the conversation on Gaza is as if there is no Hamas in Gaza. They're all civilians. Israel has declared war against the Palestinian against the Palestinian people, and the way that the casualty figures are reported. 50,000 Palestinian dead. 50,000 who? Are they all innocent? Israel has killed 50,000 women and children? That's the way, that's the perception. And in Israel, we tend to have the opposite conversation. There are no innocents in Gaza. They're all Hamas. And you hear it on TV. You hear it from newscasters. When the hostages, some of the hostages were released, and they were telling their stories about being brutalized by civilians, there were newscasters who were saying, you see, there are no innocent people in Gaza. Now, that's not a good conversation for the Jewish people to be having. We need to be able, even in the midst of this, to distinguish between armed combatants and between those who are not. And without weakening our resolve to fight this war. Because this is, I believe, this is an existential war. And I don't only mean the war with Gaza. That's just one small part. This is the Iranian-Israeli war, and it's an existential war. So how do we steel ourselves for this war while at the same time not losing our capacity for a moral conversation? And it's, you know, when you're the target of a lynch mob, which is accusing you of all kinds of inconceivable crimes, it's very hard to be self-reflective. But I don't think we have a choice.
Right. I think I'll end with just a bit of a reflection and a question for you. So when I was in Israel last month with other Holocaust Museum directors, I was really moved by the people who spoke to us who had been impacted by October 7th, a woman who lost her husband at Nir Oz, and she was reflecting on that kibbutz's efforts to rebuild and the conversations about what do we preserve from the atrocity and what do we remove and how do we build new memories and how do we preserve the memories of the life before. And many of the people who spoke to us had backgrounds in Holocaust education, and I could hear that in the way they were talking about memory making, and also just beautiful little stories of you know, the people coming to help each other in different ways and in beautiful, surprising ways. And I think that sort of that memory making is part of who we are as Jews, as we try to make sense of our past, even in these difficult times, and also, of course, that supporting one another. And I'm curious if you can share some last thoughts on that Israel, the parts of Israel that you're seeing today like that.
So there was a wonderful clip that I saw the other day about kibbutz Nir Oz, which was one of the hardest hit kibbutzim, of hundreds of volunteers who are rebuilding the kibbutz because the government isn't. And people are just coming, and the kibbutz looks beautiful. Mm-hmm. It's almost ready to be inhabited. And you can see the beginnings of an October 7th narrative in that clip. And if you think about how Jews have survived for thousands of years, it's exactly in the ways in which we navigate memory. Memory never stays on the destruction. It gradually shifts with the years and the centuries to emphasize the reconstruction.
Right.
And so and that's built into the biblical narrative. The slavery is certainly a strong part of the story, but look how much space the Torah devotes to slavery and how much space it devotes to the 40 years of wandering afterwards. And then, of course, then the whole of Tanakh becomes the story of what happens once we're in the land. But the move out of Egypt is emphasized more than the slavery. And there are lots of injunctions to remember that you were slaves in the land of Egypt, but the only time that we are told to see yourself as if you were there was with the Exodus, not the slavery. We're never told to see yourself as if you were slaves in Egypt, because that belongs to those who experienced it. None of us can be survivors of that experience. But we are all participants in the Exodus. Right. Anyone who participates in Jewish life after the Shoah is participating in the rebuilding of the Jewish people. We're all part of that story. So we're all part of the story of the leaving of Egypt. And that, I think, is really the story that we need to tell about the Shoah. And it's the story I think we will gradually, it may take a generation, but it's a story that I believe we will tell about October 7th.
Great. Thank you, Yossi.
Thank you. Thanks very much.